1835. Gidona, a village nestled in the foggy hills of northern Hungary. When workers began excavating the foundation for a new church, their shovels struck something unexpected beneath the frozen earth. It wasn't stone or tree root, it was a wooden box, sealed with wax and buried deliberately, carefully, as if someone had intended for it never to be found. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating silk, lay a collection of letters written in elegant script, a silver locket containing a lock of dark hair, and a small glass vial empty, but stained with a residue that gleamed faintly green in the winter light. The letters were all addressed to the same woman. Her name was Julia Fazekas, though the village elders who examined the discovery went pale at the sight of it and ordered the box resealed immediately. They knew that name, they knew what it meant, and they knew that some stories, once buried, should remain in the ground. But history has a way of clawing itself back to the surface. The discovery in Gidona wasn't an isolated incident. Across Central Europe throughout the early 19th century, similar findings emerged: hidden graves, unexplained deaths, women whose names appeared again and again in coroners' reports, always surrounded by deceased husbands, lovers, and suitors. Yet these cases rarely made it to trial. The women involved were often protected by superstition, fear, or the simple fact that no one wanted to believe that the hands that cooked their meals and tended their homes could also measure out death with surgical precision. This is the story of one such woman, a figure so thoroughly erased from official records that even her existence has been debated by historians. But the evidence, the letters, the bodies, the whispered testimonies tells a different story. It tells of a woman who loved deeply, passionately, and fatally. A woman whose kiss was a promise and a curse. Before we dive deeper into this chilling tale, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? I'm curious to know how many of you are hearing this story alone in the dark, because that's exactly where it belongs. The woman at the center of this forgotten horror was born in 1798, in the final years of the 18th century, in a small village that no longer exists on any modern map. Her name, according to the fragmentary records that survive, was Zsuzsanna Károly, though she would be known by different names throughout her life, each one tied to a different man, a different marriage, a different ending. She was the daughter of a midwife, a profession that in rural Hungary carried both respect and suspicion. Midwives were women who understood the mysteries of life and death, who knew which herbs could ease pain and which could stop a heart. Zsuzsanna learned at her mother's side, absorbing knowledge that most women of her era were never taught. She learned how to read the body's signs, how to mix tinctures and poultices, how to ease suffering. But she also learned something else. She learned that knowledge, in the right hands, could be a weapon sharper than any blade. By the time she reached marriageable age, Zsuzsanna was considered one of the most beautiful women in the region. Descriptions from surviving letters paint a picture of a woman with raven black hair, pale skin, and eyes that seemed to hold depths no one could quite fathom. She was intelligent, well-spoken despite her lack of formal education, and possessed a magnetism that drew men to her like moths to a flame. And like moths, they would be consumed. Her first marriage, at the age of 17, was to a farmer named István Varga, a man 20 years her senior who owned a modest plot of land and a stone house wealth enough, in that time and place, to be considered a good match. The marriage was arranged by her father, who died shortly after the ceremony from what was described as a sudden fever. István was, by all accounts, a decent man, neither cruel nor kind, simply ordinary. The marriage seemed unremarkable. For 3 years, they lived as any other couple in the village, working the land, attending church, keeping to themselves. Then, István began to complain of stomach pains. At first, they were mild and upset after meals, occasional cramping that he attributed to bad meat or spoiled milk. But the pains grew worse. He lost weight rapidly, his skin taking on a grayish pallor. The village doctor, such as he was, diagnosed it as a wasting disease and prescribed rest and prayer. Zsuzsanna nursed him devotedly, preparing his meals herself, feeding him broths and herbal teas meant to ease his suffering. The neighbors remarked on what a devoted wife she was, how she never left his bedside, how she tended him with such care. István died on a cold November morning in 1818, writhing in agony, his final words a whispered plea to his wife. The cause of death was recorded as natural illness. No one questioned it. Death from mysterious ailments was common enough in an era before modern medicine. Zsuzsanna was a widow at 20 years old. She mourned appropriately, wearing black for the required period, attending memorial services, accepting the condolences of neighbors who assured her that she was young and would certainly marry again. She inherited Istvan's property, a fact that raised a few eyebrows, as it was unusual for a woman with no children to receive everything. But Istvan had no living relatives, and his will was clear. Zsuzsanna was now a woman of independent means, a rarity in her world. She could have remained unmarried, lived quietly on her inherited land, but within 8 months, she had accepted the courtship of another man. His name was Mihaly Kovacs, a merchant who traveled between villages selling cloth and metalwork. He was younger than Istvan, handsome in a rough way, and reportedly quite taken with the beautiful widow they married in the spring of 1819. This second marriage lasted only 14 months. Mihaly began exhibiting the same symptoms Istvan had shown: the stomach pains, the progressive weakness, the grayish complexion. Once again, Zsuzsanna proved to be a devoted nurse. Once again, she prepared his meals and tended him through his decline. And once again, her husband died in considerable pain, his death attributed to natural causes. This time, a few whispers began to circulate. 2 husbands, both dead of similar ailments, both young enough that their deaths seemed premature, but whispers were not evidence. And Zsuzsanna had witnesses to her devotion. The local priest himself praised her Christian charity in caring for her dying spouse. She inherited Mihaly's assets as well. He too had no close family and found herself even wealthier than before. What happened next should have raised alarm. What happened next should have sparked investigation. But it didn't. Not yet. Because the pattern was not yet clear, and because no one wanted to believe what the pattern suggested. Zsuzsanna married again and again. Between 1820 and 1832, she would be married 5 more times. Each marriage followed an eerily similar trajectory. A courtship, often brief but passionate. A wedding, a period of apparent happiness lasting anywhere from several months to 2 years. Then the onset of symptoms, always beginning with digestive distress, always progressing to weakness and wasting, always ending in a painful death. 7 husbands in 14 years. 7 men who had been healthy before they married her. 7 men who died in her care. But there was something else, something that made the story even more disturbing when the truth finally emerged. Zsuzsanna didn't only kill her husbands. In the intervals between marriages, there were other men suitors who courted her but never made it to the altar. Lovers who shared her bed but not her name. At least 4 of these men died as well, under similar circumstances, though their deaths were easier to conceal because they had no legal connection to her. The pattern was always the same. They would pursue her, sometimes obsessively. She would accept their attention, allow intimacy. Then they would fall ill, and she would tend them, and they would die. It was as if proximity to Zsuzsanna Károly carried a curse, as if her very affection was toxic. The village where she lived, she moved several times. Always to the home of her new husband began to develop a reputation. Men started to die there with disturbing regularity, and always with the same beautiful woman at their deathbed. It wasn't until 1832 that the authorities finally took notice, and even then, it was almost by accident. A young magistrate named Andras Szabó was reviewing death records for the region as part of a routine administrative audit when he noticed the anomaly. One woman's name appeared as the widow or caretaker in 11 different death certificates spanning just over a decade. 11 deaths, 11 men, 1 woman. Szabó was young enough to be curious and ambitious enough to investigate. He began traveling to the villages where these deaths had occurred, interviewing anyone who remembered the deceased men and the woman who had survived them all. What he uncovered would eventually lead to one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Hungarian history, though it would take years for the full truth to emerge. And by then, Zsuzsanna had already disappeared. The testimonies Szabó collected painted a picture that was simultaneously romantic and horrifying. Everyone agreed that Zsuzsanna was devoted to the men in her life, that she loved them intensely, that she showered them with affection and care. But everyone also agreed that being loved by her seemed to carry a death sentence. One elderly woman who had been neighbors with Zsuzsanna and her 4th husband recalled seeing the widow grinding herbs in her kitchen late at night, the candlelight casting strange shadows on the walls. When asked what she was preparing, Zsuzsanna had smiled and said it was a special medicine to help her husband sleep through his pain. He was dead within a week. Another witness, a traveling doctor who had been called to examine one of Zsuzsanna's dying husbands, described the symptoms with clinical precision: the violent abdominal cramping, the convulsions, the way the man's fingernails had taken on a bluish tint, the peculiar sweet smell on his breath. At the time, the doctor had diagnosed it as cholera, though privately he admitted to Szabó that something about the case had troubled him. The progression was wrong, the symptoms didn't quite align, and the wife had been strangely insistent that no autopsy be performed, citing religious objections. The doctor had complied, noting only that the woman seemed genuinely distraught, weeping over her husband's body with what appeared to be sincere grief. But now, years later, reviewing his notes at the magistrate's request, he began to wonder. Those symptoms, the cramping, the convulsions, the discoloration, they matched something else entirely. They matched arsenic poisoning. Szabó's investigation took a darker turn when he discovered that Zsuzsanna's mother, the midwife who had trained her, had also been suspected of involvement in several unexplained deaths decades earlier. Nothing had ever been proven, and the old woman had died before any formal accusation could be made. But the rumors persisted. She had been known as someone who could ease suffering for those in terminal pain, a euphemism that some interpreted as mercy-killing. Others whispered that she had provided certain services to women with unwanted pregnancies or to families who wanted to hasten an inheritance. Whether any of this was true remained speculation, but it established something crucial. Zsuzsanna had grown up in an environment where the line between healing and harming, between medicine and poison, was permeable. She had been taught not just what herbs could cure, but what substances could kill, and more importantly, how to make death look natural. The magistrate's interviews revealed another disturbing pattern. Several witnesses recalled that before each husband fell ill, there had been a period of intense romantic attention from Zsuzsanna. She would become extraordinarily affectionate, preparing elaborate meals, brewing special teas and tonics, insisting on personally caring for every aspect of her husband's comfort. One survivor, a man who had courted Zsuzsanna but broken off the relationship before marriage, described how she had given him a small silver flask as a token of her affection, filled with what she called a love potion, an herbal liqueur meant to strengthen his devotion to her. He had been flattered, but also slightly unnerved by the intensity of her attention. He had drunk from the flask once and immediately felt violently ill. Frightened, he had ended their courtship abruptly and left the village. When Szabó tracked him down years later, the man still had the flask. He had kept it all those years, he said, because something about it had felt wrong. Dangerous. Szabó confiscated it and sent it to a university in Vienna for analysis. The results came back 3 months later. The residue inside the flask contained traces of white arsenic, commonly known as inheritance powder in the 19th century, for its frequent use in murders motivated by financial gain. The substance was readily available. It was sold openly as rat poison and was a common ingredient in various household products. It was tasteless, odorless when properly prepared, and its symptoms could easily be mistaken for common illnesses like cholera or dysentery, particularly in an era when diagnostic medicine was primitive at best. A person could be poisoned gradually over weeks or even months, the doses small enough to avoid immediate suspicion but cumulative in their effect, slowly destroying the victim's organs until their body finally surrendered. It was a murderer's perfect weapon, especially for someone with medical knowledge who knew exactly how much to administer and how to mask the evidence. Armed with this evidence, Szabó obtained a warrant to exhume the bodies of 3 of Zsuzsanna's husbands, whose graves were accessible and whose remains might still yield forensic evidence. This was no small undertaking in 1832. Exhumation required permission from the church, from surviving family members if any existed, and considerable expense. The process was considered deeply sacrilegious by many in the community, disturbing the rest of the dead. But Szabó persisted, driven by a growing conviction that he was pursuing not just a murderer, but a serial killer of extraordinary calculation. The exhumations took place over a period of 6 weeks in late 1832 and early 1833. What the forensic examination revealed would confirm Szabó's darkest suspicions. 2 of the 3 bodies showed unmistakable signs of arsenic poisoning, even years after death. Even in bodies that had undergone significant decomposition, arsenic could be detected because it was absorbed into the hair, nails, and bone tissue, where it remained virtually indefinitely. The forensic chemist who examined the remains used the newly developed Marsh test, a method for detecting arsenic that had only been invented 2 years earlier. The test results were conclusive. Both men had died with massive amounts of arsenic in their systems, far more than could be explained by environmental exposure or accidental ingestion. They had been poisoned deliberately, methodically, over an extended period. The third body was too degraded to yield reliable results, but the pattern was clear enough. Zsuzsanna Károly had murdered her husbands, and she had done so repeatedly over more than a decade without detection. But here the case took an unexpected turn, one that would frustrate Szabo and ultimately allow the truth to remain partially buried for generations. When he went to arrest Zsuzsanna in February of 1833, she was gone. Her most recent husband, her eighth, a prosperous mill owner named Gábor Nagy, had died just 3 months earlier. She had inherited his considerable estate, sold the property with remarkable speed, and vanished. No one in the village could say where she had gone. Some claimed they had seen her boarding a coach headed toward Vienna. Others insisted she had traveled east, perhaps to Romania or even further into the Ottoman territories. A few whispered that she had never left at all, that she was living under a new name in a nearby town, already beginning her deadly pattern anew with a fresh victim who knew nothing of her past. Szabo issued warrants for her arrest throughout the Habsburg Empire, circulating descriptions of her to local authorities across dozens of jurisdictions. But in the 1,830 seconds, before photography was common, before centralized police records, before any of the modern tools of criminal investigation existed, finding one woman who didn't want to be found was nearly impossible. Descriptions of her varied wildly. Some said she was tall, others short. Some remembered her as dark-haired. Others claimed she had begun wearing wigs. Her age was estimated anywhere from 30 to 45. The only consistent detail was that she was beautiful, dangerously so, and that she had a gift for making men fall in love with her. Several times over the following years, Szabo received reports of women matching her description who had married and whose husbands had subsequently died under suspicious circumstances. But by the time investigators arrived, the women in question had always moved on, leaving behind only graves and grief. The case became something of an obsession for Szabo. He spent years compiling evidence, tracking possible sightings, corresponding with officials across Central Europe. His investigation uncovered something even more disturbing than the murders themselves, evidence suggesting that Zsuzsanna was not acting alone, or at least that she was not unique. Szabo discovered references to other women operating in similar fashion across Hungary, Austria, and the German principalities. These women, often widows or unmarried women of a certain age, seemed to move through communities leaving a trail of dead men in their wake. They were protected by the gender assumptions of the era, the belief that women were naturally caregivers, incapable of such calculated violence, and by the primitive state of forensic science. They could kill with impunity because no one was looking for female serial killers. The concept didn't exist in the public imagination. Murder was something men did, violently and obviously. The idea that a woman could kill repeatedly, methodically, using poison and patience, was so foreign to 19th century thinking that these women operated in plain sight, their crimes hidden behind the facade of devoted wifehood and tragic misfortune. Szabo's research led him to a particularly chilling discovery. In the village archives of Nagyrev, a town several hundred kilometers from where Zsuzsanna had lived, he found records of a group of women who had been arrested in 1812 for manufacturing and selling arsenic preparations disguised as folk remedies and cosmetics. The group had been led by a woman described as a wise woman or folk healer, someone who provided herbal treatments and midwifery services. Under interrogation, one of the women had confessed that they had been selling poison specifically to wives who wanted to rid themselves of unwanted husbands. The operation had been running for at least 5 years before being discovered, and authorities estimated that as many as 30 men might have been killed using poisons supplied by this network. The case had been quietly suppressed, the women tried in secret, and most of them hanged. But the records indicated that several members of the network had never been caught. One of the names mentioned in the investigation documents was a young apprentice to the leader, a girl who had learned the craft but disappeared before the arrests were made. The name was partially illegible, damaged by water or mold, but Szabo could make out the first part, Zuz. Could Zsuzsanna have been part of this network? Had she learned her skills not just from her mother but from a wider conspiracy of women who killed for profit or to escape oppressive marriages? The evidence was circumstantial but suggestive. The timeline aligned. The Nogurev arrests happened in 1812, when Zsuzsanna would have been 14, exactly the age when a girl might be apprenticed to a trade. The description of the missing apprentice mentioned that she was remarkably pretty and clever beyond her years, phrases that matched later descriptions of Zsuzsanna. If this connection was real, it meant that Zsuzsanna's murders were not the isolated acts of one disturbed woman, but part of a broader phenomenon, a hidden history of female killers operating throughout Central Europe, exploiting the blind spots of their male-dominated society. Szabó never got the chance to pursue this line of investigation fully. In 1835, the same year the box was discovered in Gidona, András Szabó died suddenly at the age of 32. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but those who knew him found this suspicious. He had been in good health, athletic, with no history of heart problems. Moreover, his death came just days after he had written to a colleague that he believed he was close to finding Zsuzsanna, that he had received information placing her in Prague under a new identity. The letter mentioned that he was planning to travel there personally to investigate. He died before making that journey. His personal papers, including all his research on the Károly case, disappeared after his death. His widow claimed they had been confiscated by government officials, though no record of such confiscation exists. Some historians believe the papers were deliberately destroyed to prevent the scandal from becoming public. Others whisper a darker theory that Szabó had gotten too close to the truth, and that Zsuzsanna, or someone protecting her, had silenced him the same way she had silenced her husband's. After Szabó's death, the investigation into Zsuzsanna Károly effectively ceased. The authorities who inherited his case files showed little interest in pursuing a woman who might not even be alive anymore, and who in any case had disappeared into the vast anonymity of 19th century Europe. The case was quietly archived, filed away in dusty records offices where it would gather dust for decades. But the story didn't end there. Rumors persisted, growing and mutating as rumors do, spreading through villages and towns across the region. People spoke of a beautiful widow who brought death to those who loved her, a woman who could never be caught because she wore different faces, used different names. She became something between historical fact and folklore, a cautionary tale mothers told their sons about the dangers of falling for a pretty face without knowing the heart beneath. Then, in 1847, a curious incident occurred in the city of Bratislava. A wealthy banker named Ernő Horváth died unexpectedly at the age of 47, leaving behind a young wife he had married only 18 months earlier. The wife, who called herself Maria Toth, was described as being in her late 30s, beautiful despite her age, with dark hair and pale skin. She had appeared in Bratislava, seemingly from nowhere, with vague stories about being a widow from a distant province. Horváth had been infatuated with her, marrying her against the advice of his family and business associates who found something unsettling about the woman. When he died again, the symptoms were the familiar constellation of digestive agony, wasting, and convulsions. His family demanded an investigation. The city authorities, more sophisticated than their rural counterparts, ordered an immediate autopsy. The autopsy revealed massive arsenic poisoning. The examining physician noted that the concentration of poison in the body suggested administration over a period of several months, with a final, massive dose delivered in the days before death. The authorities moved to arrest Maria Toth, but once again, she had vanished. In her haste to escape, however, she had left behind some of her belongings, including a wooden chest hidden beneath floorboards in the bedroom she had shared with her late husband. Inside the chest, investigators found a collection that would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted the case for 15 years. There were letters, dozens of them, written in various hands but all addressed to different women's names: Zsuzsanna, Maria, Catalin, Erzsébet, Anna. There were newspaper clippings about deaths and funerals, carefully preserved. There was jewelry that family members of previous victims would later identify as having belonged to their deceased relatives. And there was a small leather journal, its pages filled with neat handwriting in Hungarian, documenting dates, names, and what could only be described as experimental notes on dosages and effects. The journal was perhaps the most damning evidence ever discovered in a 19th century murder case. It revealed a mind that was both organized and utterly remorseless. The entries, which spanned from 1816 to 1846, detailed each of her victims with clinical precision. She had recorded their names, their ages, their physical characteristics. She had noted how much poison she had administered, and over what period. She had described their symptoms, their suffering, with the detached interest of a scientist conducting research. Some entries included reflections on what had worked well and what she might do differently next time. There was no expression of guilt, no moral struggle, nothing that suggested she saw these men as anything more than subjects in an ongoing experiment. But there was one recurring theme throughout the journal that revealed something crucial about her psychology. She consistently referred to the poisoning as an act of love. In entry after entry, she wrote about how she had loved these men, how intensely she had felt their presence in her life, how overwhelmed she had been by the depth of her emotion. But her love, as she described it, was consuming, possessive, total. She couldn't bear the thought of her lovers leaving her, betraying her, or growing old and ordinary. She wrote of wanting to preserve them at the moment of peak devotion, to keep them forever in that state of adoration. Death, in her twisted logic, was the ultimate expression of her affection. It ensured that they would never disappoint her, never belong to another woman, never become something less than the ideal she had constructed in her mind. She was, in her own conception, granting them immortality through her memory, preserving them in the amber of her perfect love. That she had to kill them to achieve this preservation seemed, to her, a tragic necessity, an acceptable price for eternal devotion. This psychological profile would fascinate criminal experts for generations, though at the time the science of criminal psychology barely existed. What Zsuzsanna's journal revealed was one of the earliest documented cases of what modern criminologists would recognize as a particular type of serial killer, the Black Widow, who kills intimate partners. Motivated not primarily by financial gain, though she certainly profited from her crimes, but by a warped emotional need. She loved the men she killed, or believed she did. But her love was fundamentally narcissistic, focused not on their well-being, but on her own emotional experience. They existed for her consumption, literally and figuratively. When they had served their purpose, when the intensity of the relationship threatened to fade into mundane domesticity, she eliminated them and moved on to the next victim, the next grand romance, the next opportunity to feel that overwhelming rush of passion, followed by the dark satisfaction of control. The discovery of the journal caused a sensation when it became public knowledge. Newspapers across the Austrian Empire ran stories about the Poison Widow and the Angel of Death. The case became the subject of pamphlets, theatrical productions, and sensationalized accounts that mixed fact with lurid fiction. But the woman herself remained elusive. Despite renewed efforts to locate her, despite wanted posters distributed across Europe bearing an artist's rendering of her face based on witness descriptions, Maria Toth, or Zsuzsanna Károly, or whatever her real name might have been, was never captured. There were reported sightings for years afterward. In 1851, a woman matching her description was seen in Venice, though she disappeared before authorities could question her. In 1854, a suspicious death in Munich was attributed to her, but again, no arrest was made. The last credible sighting came in 1859 in a small town in southern Germany, where a middle-aged woman had married a retired military officer who died 3 months later under circumstances that were never fully explained. By this time, she would have been over 60 years old, if she was still alive at all. Some historians believe she died in obscurity, perhaps under one of her false identities, perhaps even from natural causes, taking her secrets with her. Others speculate that she may have been killed by someone who discovered her true identity, a victim's relative seeking revenge, or a would-be victim who realized the danger before it was too late. There are even darker theories, whispered in academic circles, that she was protected by powerful individuals who had their own reasons for keeping her crimes concealed. The abrupt termination of multiple official investigations, the disappearance of evidence, the mysterious death of Magistrate Sabo, all of this suggests the possibility that someone was actively helping her evade justice. Whether this protector was a former lover, a member of that alleged poison-selling network, or simply someone who found her useful, remains unknown. What we do know with certainty is this: between approximately 1,818 and 1,847, at least 11 men died under circumstances that strongly suggest arsenic poisoning, all connected to one woman who used multiple identities. The true number may be higher. Some researchers have attempted to track her movements and have found patterns of suspicious deaths in locations where she may have been present under identities that were never definitively confirmed. Conservative estimates suggest she may have killed as many as 15 men. More speculative analyses put the number closer to 20 or even 25. We will likely never know the true total because record-keeping in that era was incomplete, because many deaths were never investigated, and because she was adept at disappearing before suspicion could coalesce into action. The question that haunts this case, the question that researchers still debate, is why. Financial gain was certainly part of it. She inherited substantial wealth from her victims. But she didn't need to kill so many times to achieve financial security. After her first few victims, she had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Yet, she continued, seeking out new men, initiating new relationships, administering new doses of poison. The journal entries suggest that the murders themselves had become necessary to her emotional life, that the cycle of seduction, possession, and destruction was something she craved. She was addicted to the power of it, the intimacy of watching someone die by her hand while believing she was caring for them. It gave her a sense of control in a world where women had very little control over their own lives. She was, in a perverse way, claiming agency through murder, exercising power over life and death in an era when women were expected to be powerless. Her story also reveals something deeply unsettling about the society that allowed her to operate for so long. She succeeded because the institutions designed to prevent and punish crime were built around masculine assumptions about violence. Police looked for men who killed in fits of rage, who left obvious evidence, who couldn't resist boasting about their crimes. They weren't looking for a woman who killed quietly, patiently, in the privacy of the home, using tools that were readily available and methods that mimicked natural illness. The very qualities that made her dangerous, her knowledge of herbs and medicine, her role as caregiver, her position in the domestic sphere, were the same qualities that made her invisible to law enforcement. She weaponized society's expectations about femininity, using them as camouflage for serial murder. The case of Zsuzsanna Károly, or whatever her real name was, remains officially unsolved. No arrest was ever made, no trial ever took place, no execution brought closure to the families of her victims. She exists in historical records as a shadow, a collection of aliases and suspected crimes. A woman whose face we cannot truly see and whose ultimate fate we cannot know. The box discovered in Gdona in 1835, with its letters and locket and poison vial, was eventually destroyed by church authorities who considered it cursed. The journal found in Bratislava in 1847 survived longer, becoming part of the Habsburg criminal archives, but it too eventually disappeared, possibly lost in the chaos of World War I when many archives were destroyed or scattered. Today, only fragments remain: court documents, newspaper accounts, letters from investigators, and the persistent legend of a woman whose kiss meant death. What happened to the bodies of her victims? Most remain buried in village cemeteries across Central Europe, their graves unmarked or marked only with simple stones bearing names and dates that reveal nothing of how they died. A few were moved by relatives who wanted them interred in family plots far from the woman who had killed them. At least 2 were exhumed during the investigations and then reburied in consecrated ground after the forensic examinations were complete. These men existed. They lived and loved and died, and their deaths were not natural, not acts of God or fate, but murders carried out with premeditation and cold precision by someone they had trusted completely. The families of the victims were left with impossible grief, the kind that comes from betrayal as much as loss. They had watched their sons, brothers, and fathers marry this woman. They had celebrated at the weddings, welcomed her into their homes. Some had even liked her, been charmed by her, felt sympathy for her when she was widowed again and again. Then they learned the truth, or as much of the truth as was ever revealed, and they had to reconcile 2 incompatible realities: the devoted wife they had observed, and the calculating killer those same observations should have revealed. Many families refused to believe it even when presented with evidence. They clung to the idea that their loved one had died of natural causes, that the accusations against Zsuzsanna were exaggerations or lies, because accepting the truth meant accepting that they had been utterly deceived, that evil had sat at their dinner tables wearing a beautiful face and smiling while it planned murder. Beyond the immediate families, The case sent ripples through the communities where these deaths occurred. Villages that had lost multiple men to the same woman developed a paranoia about outsiders, about beautiful widows, about women who seemed too eager to care for sick husbands. The case reinforced existing prejudices against women who possessed knowledge of herbs and medicine, contributing to a climate of suspicion around midwives and folk healers that persisted for decades. It also influenced legal and medical practice, contributing to the development of more rigorous death investigations and the standardization of autopsies in suspicious cases. The Marsh test for arsenic, which had been crucial in confirming the poisonings, became a standard tool in forensic investigations throughout Europe, partly because of high-profile cases like this one. The story of the poisoned widow became part of the cultural consciousness, appearing in novels, plays, and eventually films, though usually in sensationalized versions that bore little resemblance to the historical facts. She was transformed into a Gothic villain, a femme fatale, a cautionary tale about the dangers of female sexuality and autonomy. These fictional versions obscured the real woman, whoever she was, and the real horror of what she had done. They turned a case of serial murder into entertainment, stripping away the human cost, the grief of the families, the terror of the victims who died slowly, painfully, while believing they were being cared for by someone who loved them. So what truth remains buried here? Perhaps it's simply this, that evil is often ordinary, that it can wear a familiar face and speak with a gentle voice, that the monsters who inhabit our world rarely look like monsters at all. Zsuzsanna Károly killed at least 11 men, possibly many more. And she did it in the most intimate way possible through the daily rituals of care and affection that define domestic life. She served death with their meals, measured it into their medicine, administered it with kisses and caresses, and for decades, she got away with it because no one could imagine that a woman could do such things, that love could be so thoroughly poisoned. History tried to bury her story, tried to forget, tried to pretend she was just legend and rumor. But the evidence exists, fragmentary but real, testifying to crimes that actually happened, to lives that were actually taken. Where are you right now as you hear this story? Are you alone? Are you thinking about the people in your life, wondering if you really know them as well as you think you do? That uncomfortable feeling, that's the truth, pushing against the comfortable fictions we tell ourselves about safety and trust. Zsuzsanna Károly understood something fundamental about human nature. We want to believe in love. We want to trust those who claim to care for us, and that desire makes us vulnerable. She exploited that vulnerability with surgical precision over and over for 3 decades. If this story has unsettled you, if it's made you think about the darkness that can hide behind ordinary facades, then share it with someone else. These histories need to be told, not to sensationalize violence, but to understand it, to recognize that the patterns of the past still echo in the present. Subscribe to hear more forgotten stories from History Shadows, stories that reveal truths we'd rather not face but cannot afford to ignore. Hit that like button if this documentary made you see the past differently, and drop a comment telling me what historical mystery should we uncover next. The poisoned kiss, the devoted wife, the buried box in Gedona, these aren't just elements of a story from 2 centuries ago. They're reminders that history's silence often hides its darkest truths, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one who claims to love you most.